Our second speaker this afternoon is Thom, Dr. Brian Thom. Thom is an associate professor in the Anthropology department at the University of Victoria, where he founded the Ethnographic Mapping Lab, a collaboration between the indigenous communities, UVic faculty, and graduate students who are working on cartographic projects that attend to indigenous priorities in land and resource rights, intergenerational knowledge sharing, and public education. The project works to provide extensive training and expertise for indigenous communities who are interested in deploying Google Earth and related tools for restoring indigenous landscapes. Dr. Thom's talk today is titled Ethnographic Mapping and Indigenous Cartographies. Please welcome Brian Thom.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. It's just an honor to be down in the territories of the Nez Perce and the Palouse peoples, and to be here with you in Pullman. It doesn't seem so far from Victoria in some ways, but as I was flying over the Cascades looking at that incredible landscape, I realized that this is a very different and much colder place than Vancouver Island. But I've had a very warm welcome, and I thank you all. I'm an anthropologist who's I've worked in Coast Salish territories really all of my adult life, where I live and raise my family and work. And it's been a great privilege and honor to be able to think through the ideas of land and landscape, territory and place, with the communities who are our neighbors, our friends, our collaborators, and these are very vital and important questions. And so my talk today, I hope to talk about some of the motivations that the indigenous communities I work with have for getting involved in mapping, and share with you examples of the work that we've been doing through UVic's Ethnographic Mapping Lab to meet these goals that communities have. To map their territories and their cultures and their lives and landscapes. Some of the challenges within that, some of the ways that we've navigated those challenges. We've heard so many good stories today about these things, and I think they've been resonating with me for the last several hours. So I really hope that this is in conversation with the other papers today. So most of my work has been indeed on Vancouver Island, just north of Victoria, in the territories of the Hul'qumi'num speaking peoples. It's also where Dr. Colin Greer and many of his grad students work. So there's another WSU connection to Hul'qumi'num territories here. And I have also had the great privilege and pleasure to work with the Edelman peoples in Kamchatka in the Russian Far East, who have invited me to do a collaboration on community mapping in their territories as they're become concerned about issues related to many of the kinds of themes that we've been talking about today. And these are vital, ongoing relationships with the land. These indigenous territories, as we heard in our first talk today, are very much about the present and the future. They're really about people's vital connection to their homelands and the places that are important to them, that are meaningful, that their ancestors have lived in, and that continue to have relations with the plants, the animals, all the non-human persons in the world that demand those relationships of care and respect. And particularly on Vancouver Island, but also in the areas that I've worked in the Russian Far East, these are relationships that continue today to be challenged by these kinds of colonial relationships that we've been talking about, the kinds of exercise of power by the state, by corporations, by landowners, who seem oblivious to the lives of the indigenous communities who continue to dwell in their territories, and at worst are actively continuing to dispossess them of their resources and their lands. And these are very challenging situations to bear witness to and to be a part of, resisting them and trying to make different communities for our futures. Some of this work has led us to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, taking Canada up for human rights violations, for the non-recognition of the property rights and the cultural rights of the Hul'qumi'num communities. So these are very serious serious matters. A lot of them are rooted in, you know, the sort you mentioned earlier, robber barons, right? They're rooted in the kind of colonial dispossession of land on the east coast of Vancouver Island, in the particular scenario that unfolded there in 1884 when a coal baron, James Dunsmuir, was granted freehold title to the entire east coast of Vancouver Island in exchange for financing the building of a railway. And this, in one moment, privatized the entire territory of the Hul'qumi'num communities and has had a really long, devastating impact on their exercise of sovereignty, on the way they are able to control their futures. They've been very much a part of the terrible dispossessions that have happened, the kind of deep inequalities that we can see when we go out into the communities today, the kind of riveting crisis around housing, around healthy places for children to be raised in their families, and poverty. And all of those kinds of crises aren't don't just stem from nowhere. They're not just because of all the stereotypes that people have about Indigenous communities. They go back to the original theft of the land and the active work that the state has had to contain the people's relations to these small areas of Indian reserves that you can see on this map, which are very dysfunctional ways to relate to territory. But, the people continue to assert that sovereignty over the land in Canada, much like our examples earlier today here in the US, and rely on their Indigenous knowledge, their own ways of seeing and knowing, their own ways of relating to the places and beings in the world. And those the words of the elders, the knowledge that the chiefs are trained in from a young age, become very important in shaping how those decisions get made about what happens in the future, about how these battles for control unfold and what their outcomes are. And in many ways, that one of the ways that those leaders have asked for this to unfold is through engaging in these kinds of mapping projects, with all the risks of cartographic inscription that we were just listening to for the last hour. There's still a desire to map their important places, to mark out the places that are named, that have history, that they have continuing relationships with, the places where people own and treasure, the places that they gather their roots and their salmon berries and the reef net fishing and so on. All of those places are being carefully tended to and documented in these kinds of community mapping initiatives. And that data is very much treasured. It's very much held privately by communities and used for purposes that range, as the introduction said, from this sort of inspiring the younger generation. I loved seeing the pictures earlier on of the kids weaving the baskets made of the roots. I mean, that sort of inspiration is exactly what's at the heart of so many of these conversations around the land. But also to challenge these kinds of historical and ongoing relationships of colonialism and territorial dispossession. So, as anthropologists who have a complicated history in respect of Indigenous peoples, and that was acknowledged earlier today as well. I think anthropologists have been certainly part of that problem in the past, but I think that today I hope anyway that we're working in a new relationship with a new care of attention and respect to the kinds of priorities that communities have, and we realize that we have something to offer, in terms of the methodologies that we bring, the kinds of attentions to our representational practices, and there's a lot of work to do, a lot of work that can have impact in a huge range of decisions and of community life. So I have on this slide just a few examples of areas that our ethnographic mapping lab has been working in with communities. My talk today is going to be to take you through a few examples of some of these areas. But at the heart of it, I think we're trying to appreciate a range of kind of property relations, but also issues related to cultural heritage, traditional food, livelihood, the legal and political issues related to industrial resource extraction, but also the very life projects that people have in moving forward as Indigenous communities and maintaining their strong cultures and ways of seeing and relating to the world. So in this slide, you can see many different kinds of mapping. Maybe I won't go over them all, but they do range from a kind of broad territorial boundary making to detailed recording of place names and places for people exercise their customary and traditional land use. Archaeological sites, of course, inventorying those, but also looking forward in the future and thinking about land use planning. So these are all things that I hope to bring up today. Really, there's a particularly Canadian toolkit that was developed back in the 1970s in response to the Canadian government's comprehensive land claims settlement process. And it involves what we call map biography, doing map biographies. This is where basically we go into communities with topographic maps or our Google Earth platform, and we talk to people about their lives. We ask them about their lives to share with us the places that they've gone hunting and fishing and trapping, where their cabins and camps are, and have them point out to us these locations, and we mark them on the map. And you do that with one person and 2 and 5 and 10 and 200 and 1,000 people, and you start to build very comprehensive inventories of the extensiveness of land use and occupancy. And at least in the Canadian system, and I know, well, I only speak to the Canadian system, those demonstrating land use and occupancy is a very clear path for Indigenous peoples to have their legal rights recognized by the state and through the courts, and to have their rights to where their say in development projects will be recognized and what the shape of that will be. So they're very powerful conversations to be having, ones that are bound up in these kinds of state processes of recognition. And they're ones that the communities enjoy doing. A big part of what we're interested in is training young people from the community to how to use simple and accessible tools like Google Earth, and then to fly around the landscape. You don't always have time and the resources to be able to go out on field trips, which are lovely but very expensive and time intensive. But you can fly over these places that you can see in Google Earth and have elders holding a little laser pointer and pointing out the places that they want to share with the young people at the table, who can very readily document those places and the kinds of land uses that happen there. These are processes that get videotaped, that get transcribed, that databases are built around to associate metadata with each of the locations that are recorded. But done across a community and over generations, they produce very, very powerful maps. So this is an example of some of the work we were doing in Russia. The Edelman community was quite concerned about the expansion of Russian oil and gas interests into their territories. They had gone through a historical process in the 1950s of being removed and relocated from their villages. But they're very much still salmon people who were active fishers, and they wanted to draw on these kinds of expertise and share them with their young people in the community so that they could be at the table in a meaningful way. Being able to have conversations when these Russian interests were coming into their territories and saying, no, these are our places for mushrooms. These are our places for where the reindeer need to graze. These are our crucial salmon habitat. So they've been very, we've been able to produce some very powerful maps that draw on Indigenous language names for places, but also these community histories. And I think it's a good example of applying that map biography method to this idea that we can resist land and resource development. Another project that we did, actually close to where Dr. Greer works, is with the Lyaxan First Nation, whose home before they were resettled was on Valdez Island. They still have reserve lands on Valdez Island in the Salish Sea. You can see it from Vancouver if you're standing, up at the cliffs of UBC looking across the Salish Sea. You can see Valdez Island there. And they were very concerned that with the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and the increase of large ships, containers that would be bringing bitumen, crude oil basically, out of the port of Vancouver to markets overseas, that their special places would be potentially impacted by those. So we worked to do some of this documentation, and they brought that information into the National Energy Board process, and was very much a large part of their voice in how they articulated their resistance to that kind of industrial development. But that kind of mapping, in a way, gives you a lot of dots on a map. It gives you a lot of points, lines, and polygons with a little bit of information associated with each, but it tends to mask over a lot of these more deeper relationships with place. When you're flying around in Google Earth dropping dots, you don't have time to attend to ceremony, to really attend to the kinds of cultural practices and relationships that go with those kinds of places. Those are slower conversations. And, but ones that communities are also very interested in carrying out. And so we're, with community like the Staminas First Nation has been very interested in having those more what we call significant places mapping. Places where we're going to slow down and maybe over the course of 2 or 3 years talk about 20 places altogether. But have deeper conversations about those places. Have the time to go out and visit them. Have the time for the elders to share and point out what's really important, and to teach us about their histories and about the ways we can relate to those places. And in the program that we did collaboratively with Staminas, it was an after-school program with youth from the community who my very capable graduate student, Amy Becker, trained on doing digital video. And the kids were basically taking these video cameras out with their elders to places that we had already documented the Indigenous name for those places. And the kids went in an engagement about, well, what makes these places special? And in those moments of teaching and sharing and that kind of intergenerational exchange were very, very powerful. And the kids then, again, using simple-to-use tools that were just off the shelf that they could access just by opening their browser and loading up a program like Google My Maps, were able to annotate those landscapes and draw in the YouTube videos that they were making, and photos that they had taken, and transcripts of the stories that the elders had shared with them, to make a map that they really intend to circulate in their community, in their schools, as a point of conversation locally about, not about their entire territories, but about their home, about the places immediately around them. And this is a really a remarkable project that had that opportunity for that kind of very rich exchange. But attending to these cultural matters, you also have to attend, I think, to the cultural concerns that come up. And these things, when you produce a map like this, these need to stay in relation to the people who they're producing it. So many of the stories were shared by the late Willie Seymour, a very powerful Hul'qumi'num elder and speaker, knowledge carrier who passed away a few years ago. And following Coast Salish law, you can't bring out pictures of people for a period of time after their death. You don't want to evoke their particular stories, their Indian names. And so we use these tools to respond to those things. We don't show, we basically were using the ability to turn on and off on a site-by-site level what videos are shown, what photos are shown. We're able to respond to those kinds of cultural concerns. And I think that that's a very helpful thing to attend to when we're making these maps and be aware of the kinds of consequences of the cartographies and the way these cartographies have lives beyond the moment of generating them in the projects that we're doing. I should also say that map, these are very powerful stories, and the community later got involved in litigation with the state around unrecognized title in another area. And so I can't share the URL with the site with you right now because it's not working. We've pulled the whole site down as the lawyers are concerned about how it may be used against their communities by the Crown in cross-examination. So this even something as simple as going out with children and having conversations between uncles and nieces about important places get bound up with the kind of exercise of state power. And I think it complicates those kinds of relations, and the creative ways that you guys dealt with the way you showed those sorts of things were really inspiring, and I think we should all be attending to that. I thought I'm here speaking to a digital humanities group, so this is maybe our one kind of real digital humanities project. This is a mapping project that we launched in using Google My Maps to map out the places that Siemtenot, Mary Rice, a Penelakut elder who lived in the 1920s and 30s, sharing stories of her community with a newspaper reporter of the day, a woman named Beryl Cryer. These stories were published in the local paper and then largely sat in the archives since the 30s, the mid-30s, and then were collected and edited by a scholar from UBC, a guy named Chris Arnett, an anthropologist who put them together. But when you read the stories, they're wonderful stories, they're myths, they're legends, they're histories of first contact and colonization. They're stories about traditional knowledge and family relations, but they're always about the land. And it always struck me that we ought to try to map those out. And so we had a team of graduate students over a summer basically go through that whole collection, about 350 pages of materials, and meticulously map out those territories and give excerpts from the book and detailed page references so you can go back to the book. We actually produced a copy for the community with the full transcripts, kind of like pushing copyright there probably a little. But and then for the public-facing one, just has small excerpts of each of the stories, pointing you to going where you could read more. And what we found, we sort of put this out on the web, and we didn't know like who would be interested in, who would use it, and why. And what we found is that again, it's the kids in the school who really enjoy picking this up and bringing their phone out and calling up that map on Google Earth on their phone, or on the Google My Maps app, or even in Google Maps. You can surface KML data very easily in these tools. And they love exploring and playing the little slide reels that we have of historic photos that are associated with some of the places, and actually going to the places and relating to them on the ground as they're listening to the story that Siemtenot shared back in the 30s. It transcends time in a very, very powerful way, very visceral way. I guess the other kind of main mapping technique that we've been involved in over the years is really documenting Indigenous names for the land. This is an important project in light of all the work that Indian residential schools did to dispossess people of their language, and of course the colonial cartography has done to exercise that doctrine of discovery, that terra nullius, the empty landscape. And Indigenous peoples are very concerned everywhere we work with having their names recognized and mapped out. And whether they've done this as part of land claims negotiations or done this as part of school projects, it's definitely a crucial piece of work. But place names are complicated, and And you know, that's probably some of the most challenging information to work with, and to try to get it right, to attend to not only the kind of linguistic detail. You know, you need to have some of that ability, that mastery of language, to be able to write them down or to record them well, and know where they are on the land, and know how to relate them to the particular geographic features that they describe. And as a part of that kind of resurgence, people are rediscovering these places themselves, right? It's not that everybody has inventories of 700 Indigenous names in their heads. This is knowledge that's coming out again through those kinds of opportunities we have to go out on the land. And so in part of our work, we're definitely attending to not just making decisions about what's the right name for a place, but recording all the different things that people tell us and not making decisions about that. And recognizing that different communities have the name for the same place, and it might be a similar name, it might be a different name, and choosing which one to put first on the map has an implication, right? So we're very concerned about how to do that, how to make these kinds of representations, and it ends up making messy maps, right? Not nice, clean maps with simple labels and so on, but what I think ones that reveal the more of the nuance that the place names have. And I just put this slide here. I mean, this is from some of the very first place names work that I did in the early 90s with the Stalo communities up in the Fraser Valley. And they were very concerned that we do get place names right, and that we don't spread them around inappropriately. There's this great name, Quiquiala. It means stingy container. It's about a very specific place on a creek that drains from Kakwa Lake up near Hope, if you've ever been up there. But today, if you drive around that part of the Fraser Valley, you can see the Coquihalla Towing Company and the Coquihalla Highway and the Coquihalla Gas Station, and they're very concerned that these names get out and they get commercialized, or they get used in ways that lose that sort of very specific sense. And so there's always a tension around place names and how much they can share, and how much that they're willing to make public, and at what risk. So those are conversations that we're definitely actively having. So I'm just going to blow through some of these maps, because I just want to say that we're not only mapping culture, right? Communities are very concerned with kinds of issues like, industrial clear cutting and the effects of those clear cutting on their territories. So we're training our students to do things like remote sensing, so that they can use satellite imageries and air photos to detect deforestation and map those out in relationship to the kinds of places that are important. Or to see the impacts of urbanization through data like light pollution, or the way road networks have expanded into territories, and showing those in layers, in a way, in relationship to these other kinds of cultural landscapes that are so important. The massive alienation from the fishery is a very stinging and difficult position for many of the Vancouver Island Coast Salish communities, whether it's the closure of beaches through biotoxins, or fecal coliform, or it's the impact on salmon habitat. And I really got to say, in Washington State, it seems like that's such a incredible place to be, where the protection for the salmon seems to be coming out of the treaties, right? And the kind of exercise of that jurisdiction from those treaties. And I really respect that. I think that's something we really need to learn from. Or conflicts over ancestral sites, where graves are being desecrated, archaeological sites are being destroyed to make way for development, and the kinds of conflicts that people are having around those things. Those are all important issues that people want to have on the map. So we've got a large set of these that we've made in collaboration with Hulkaminam communities to reveal the kinds of relationships between these kinds of large-scale industrial and activities and urbanization and Indigenous territories. So just to share two specific stories about projects that are ongoing that try to grapple with this. And I was trying to think here about the themes in the proposal around communities and around place-based education. So the first one is around communities and municipal land use planning. nothing very anthropological sounding about municipal land use planning. But I recently moved from the community I lived in for about 20 years in Ladysmith, which is 100 kilometers from the university. It's a very long 3 hours a day I was spending in the car every day. So I moved close to the university to a new community called Cordova Bay. And as a citizen, I showed up at a meeting that the town was going to redo their land use plan. It had been 20 years since they visited their land use plan, where all the zoning for, multifamily housing and single family and transportation corridors and parks and all the kinds of things municipal governments exercise their jurisdictions over. And I went to these meetings and I realized that there was no recognition of the treaty or any recognition of Indigenous history or presence or vision of the future that the municipality was talking about in relation to the place I had just moved to. So I said, well, how about, what are your plans to indigenize your land use plan? And they said, well, we have no idea how to do that. It never occurred to us. We have no Indian reserves within the municipality, so we didn't think it was our problem. And I said, well, you should learn some basic things about where your municipality is so that you can consider these. And they asked for help. So we started to do a project together where I pointed out things that were in historical documents, that were in the archives, that were in the museum, that were in the archaeology branch records, to show that in fact there's this is not Cordova Bay, this is Tsalich that you're planning about. This is an Indigenous community that was dispossessed in the late 1850s, at a similar time that these things were going on in California. Similar things were happening in British Columbia. And that there's all kinds of values and teachings about the land that you could bring into your land use plans. And I started then working with some of the local First Nation communities and their umbrella organization to facilitate a dialogue about how those values and teachings could be brought into the process. But we tend to forget. I think you were saying earlier something about colonial unseeing or something like that, right? Like it was, this is a community that for 20 years was exhuming Indigenous burials and celebrating it on the front page of the local newspaper, and these horrible graphic articles, with the skulls and the bones and all of that. And the people who were doing this kind of desecration are set out in the local histories as the sort of heroes, the founders of the community, right? The non-Aboriginal founders of the community. And so I have to bring this up. This is something that we should be talking about. And in fact, the mall development that's planned there for the exact site that 9 burials were removed over this 20-year period just about unfolded over the course of the last few months without even an archaeological inspection. None of this information had ever made it into the archaeological registries and so on. So there's lots of work to do on the ground to sort of bring the kinds of things we see in the archives, in the historical record, in the archaeological record, into conversations with everyday life things that are happening in our communities that we face as we are just going to a meeting about how big the next cul-de-sac is going to be. We're doing similar work with Parks Canada, working with the different communities, 6 different communities who are in a cooperative management relationship with Parks Canada. They partnered with us to create a big inventory of traditional knowledge in relation to the areas in and around the Gulf Island National Park Reserve. They wanted to be, the Indigenous members of the community, again, said, we want to be able to pull our phone out of our pocket and be able to have easy access to that information. But we don't want to share it with Parks Canada. We don't want this to be a parks project where we have to be trusting them to steward the data and to share the data back with us. We want it to be our own. So this is an example of some of that mapping that we did that is really for the committee to help bring their stories into the management of the Gulf Islands National Park Reserve. I think I'll just keep going on. I'll talk about education next here and give you a little example of some of the work that we're doing on education. Our main project right now is launched by Cowichan tribes as part of the Canada 150 celebrations that we just had about a year and a half ago. Cowichan Tribe said that part of those celebrations, we want to commemorate an ancestral site that was just about obliterated in an urban development application that Cowichan fought for 20 years to protect and save from development, a site with 2,000-year-old archaeological record, a 3-component site, and many burials on the site. And some of the earlier components of the site have a significant domestic features, a structure, all kinds of evidence of life from 2,000 years ago. And this place, they said, is a place that is located, if I get the next map, it's located within walking distance of 3 schools. And so they said, why don't we have this as a place where we can inspire and engage our own youth in about our own history, and a place where the broader community can come and learn even some basic things about Cowichan history and culture and values and teachings, so that as we're having these larger societal conversations about reconciliation and so on, we have a particular place that we can ground those conversations in, we can ground our common experience in. And so through this work, we've been doing all kinds of oral history work with elders, archaeological analysis, some joint interpretation of the archaeological record with members of the community, doing some landscaping and creating paths and trails and interpretive nodes at the site so people can come and visit this place and appreciate Cowichan's values that went behind why it was saved, and the histories and future visions of the Cowichan community and how we would all relate to that. We recently put up signs. We're actually just about to launch 4 more signs that really try to connect this place to the broader Coast Salish landscape. Actually, just standing here in Eastern Washington makes me think one of the favorite things that Lishim, the elder in green there, likes about this site is we found about 19 obsidian blades. Obsidian is like volcanic glass. And I'm not very technical with this, but if you bounce X-rays off obsidian, you can read its fingerprint and you can know where it originally came from by comparing it to other bits of obsidian that other people have bounced X-rays off of. You guys probably do this here. And as it turns out, the obsidian found in the Cowichan Valley on Vancouver Island is all from the Newberry volcano in eastern Oregon. And Lishim loves this idea because this reinforces the oral histories that he's been taught about his family's travels to the Columbia River and then inland. And although this is a 2,000-year-old component of the site that the obsidian was from, it really reinforces the kind of idea that Coast Salish people have long had expansive social relations with each other. Yeah, it's a story that he really loves to tell through the archaeological work. And the kids love it. You know, we've had a grade 7 class out there. In fact, a French immersion class, so we're doing some challenges of dealing with 3 languages here, and learning from it and trying to reflect their learning as they're encountering these values. And I think, like you said, our idea is that in the future, this shouldn't be stunning. This should just be normal. This is what everybody in the community will have grown up learning and knowing about. We're trying to engage the youth in all kinds of different ways. So we're using Google Cardboard and Street View cameras to go to special places, places that are named in Hulkameetnam. And Google's created this gallery in Street View where you can visit some of these special places, and have provided us little blocks of text so that usually when you're in Google Street View, as you probably know, you just drive around in your car. But here, if you go to these places, little windows of text come up and you can learn something about the Indigenous values of those places. So that's a very powerful project, I think, one that we've really enjoyed making these images. And others. I guess I could just go on. Our graduate students have been very busy in the lab engaging different communities on the projects that they've wanted done. And we have a nice set of icons just for the mapping nerds in the room. I encourage you to check out our icons. There's about 700 of them in different color schemes. I know that the GVSIG community has just created a mass import of those icons. So if you're using that open source GIS, you've already got them in your system. But we encourage you, they're all open source. You're welcome to use and redistribute them for your own Indigenous mapping projects. We're busy with training. We do a lot of workshops in Indigenous communities, either by Skype and Google Hangouts or in person. It's really, I think using these geo-tools is really best left in the hands of the community. And so it's a lot of fun to do that kind of training. And we have a website. So that's about all I had to say. Thank you.
So thank you, Brian. We have about 10 minutes for questions. If anybody has questions or comments, I will bring you the microphone so that everyone can hear, and we're recording it as well. I'm just going to talk till I get back here.
Thank you. Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. I want to mention a modern artist actually from Spokane, just north of here, Ben Joyce, Topophilia Abstract. And it isn't informed by this kind of vital information, but it's an interesting modern interpretation of topophilia, love of landscape, looking down from maybe the stratosphere onto a site all over the world. He has projects all over the world. And he has a great website, Ben Joyce, Topophilia Abstract. And the other, and I don't know what you think about modern art, modernism, post-everything, you know, this kind of information. I'd like to know what you think of that. The other thing, I was a journalist in Hawaii, and it's the only place I've ever been where teams of young people would literally walk with the bulldozers in case they unearthed anything, and then just get in front of the bulldozer. I don't see that in the mainland.
Boy, that would be something. You know, I think that people are really, they are keeping their eyes on the back dirt piles for sure in these communities where they're able to. You know, that map of ancestral site conflicts that I showed earlier, almost every one of those happened not because the developer dutifully reported the incidental finds, but because people were there, you know, on the site when the construction was happening that caused the desecration in the first place. And I think, you know, how do we scale that up? How do we institutionalize the care and respect for these places? Right? I think this sort of projects like land use planning, these land use planners are nice people. They don't want to desecrate sites any more than anybody else does, right? And so I think there are windows, there are openings that we don't have to necessarily just go out and surveil those things, but we can engage Indigenous sovereignties and be sure that Indigenous peoples are involved fundamentally in the decision makings throughout their territories, ceded or unceded. It's irrespective. These ancestral lands need to be cared for and respected. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Bobby, did you have a question? Is your hand up? Where's, oh, no. No, okay. Sorry, I thought I said, oh, sorry.
Thank you so much. This is fantastic work. I'm curious. I'm going to ask about Cartesian coordinates again. I'm curious about your work on Indigenous names, and if you encounter and the communities encounter tension between kind of the representation of the Earth via the grid and the Cartesian coordinates versus community kind of epistemologies of place.
Absolutely.
And how do you negotiate?
Oh, it's the
those?
worst. So, the worst, you know, that conversation comes up every time you lift your mouse to choose whether it's going to be a point, a line, or a polygon. You know, I've got the name, I've been there on a boat, I've been standing beside somebody who's pointing out that mountain face, that's a person who was transformed at the beginning of time after a battle with a shaman, and then I need to draw a polygon of that. Right, and somehow capture that spatially in a way that represents it, and it's very unsatisfying, and it's complicated, and I don't think has a good answer. I think the easy answer was to say, well, we should not use a kind of, we should just put a dot on a map and hope that signifies somehow that there's a greater space involved here, but doesn't turn it into a grid. But in an environment where people are concerned about environmental impacts and, you know, the lines that pipelines transect or cut blocks transect, when people running ArcGIS are doing queries and they're, you know, looking for intersects and buffers and all that kind of stuff, those dots don't produce the kinds of landscapes that are satisfying to that kind of analysis. And so then we get the directions to make polygons everywhere, which end up being very unsatisfying. So I'm not sure that there's a great solution to that. You have to be transparent, I think, is like you said, really. Yeah.
So one of the things that you brought up was this, the tension between mapping places that people want to understand for themselves or for the group versus their availability to the larger world. And I'm wondering how you finesse that with Google. So if it's open source, how open is it and how closed is it?
So using Google GeoTools involves a series of decisions. And you have to be aware of the different platform that you're using and what the consequences of that platform are for those decisions. At the level of ownership of the data, this is not an issue. Even if it's in Google's cloud or on your hard drive, those KML files are yours. You own them, or the communities, however you work out the ownership relations of that data. So in our case, we ensure that this is all community data owned by the community. And but then the question is, well, how do we manage the privacy issues with respect to those and the abilities for governments to surveil them? And in the Canadian context, we're actually quite concerned about things like the Patriot Act and the operation of how, for instance, if the Canadian government were, as the previous Canadian government actually did, characterize an Indigenous organization as a terror group that was anti-pipeline, they could make a request to their friends south of the border, and the Five Eyes network would do its thing, and there'd be the possibility of that if that data was held on, say, Google's servers. So there's an impetus for people to say, well, maybe we ought to not have all of that data, the data that could have these kinds of consequences, particularly as we enter into these more seriously contested areas like pipelines and large-scale industrial developments, to keep that material safe at home. And just like any other, your Word document or your Excel, in Google Earth, when you save that KML to your desktop, it's just a file on your desktop. You're viewing the images of the Earth that Google's serving from its cloud, and you're overlaying your own data on top of that. So it provides the most robust privacy, but then locally you got to have a good system for backups and all those kinds of things, which I'm sure your team here at WSU have faced all those issues in spades. So those challenges often have people making choices about whether they engage the cloud or not, or to what extent, or what data sets go in the cloud and what just stay at home, and who has access to what. In the cloud services, you have quite granular control. You can go right down to the individual user you want, or only people with the link, or people are making it public. So communities have exercised those in ways that suit them. I think the tool is useful, but you have to be knowledgeable about it. On our website, we actually wrote a white paper. So if you go to ethnographic.mapping.uvic.ca, you can read. We worked with graduate students in our law program to review the Google Terms of Service and to write out advice for communities. Not legal advice, but things to consider. Thank you.
Time for one final question. If anybody has a question. Oh, in the back. Okay. I also want to point out how that goes nicely with what Rukiwa was saying about making this very explicit, your design choices and your tool choices and the limits of each type of platform.
Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
A while ago, I worked in a mapping project as well, and a couple of times I've done some things related to mapping with communities and community mapping more directly and stuff. In some cases, we tried to incorporate something similar to this using Google Maps, but we had the issue that where we work, there's no internet, so we couldn't do that, so we were trying to figure out different ways. And also we were trying to figure out ways to incorporate everybody or make it more engaging for everybody in the communities. And one of the issues when in places where we were able to use something similar to this, a more basic level, young people definitely get more engaged on everything, but the elders didn't.
Right.
And that was a bit of an issue that we had. And we were trying to figure out ways to change that. And the one way we figured it out was to create these three-dimensional maps.
The physical one.
Physical maps at a small scale. And to be able, for the older people, the elders, to be able to see their territory in a way that they're more used to instead of in a screen. And then they would say like, oh, okay, now I know what you're talking about. And now I can see that these guys were showing you something's wrong or whatever, right? So I don't know if you had some kind of like issues like that or situations like that, that it becomes really complicated in a sense to first work in a place where there's no internet, and secondly, how to do something to engage everybody.
So just on the subject of internet, of course, we're working in Southwest British Columbia, so the broadband is excellent there. But when we were working in the Edelman communities in the Russian Far East, not so much. They were terrible. You may not know that in Google Earth, while you have an internet connection, you can fly over the area that you want at different scales, and Google Earth creates a cache of the information that you're pre-flying. So when we go into communities that do have worse internet, we create that cache and use that in offline Google Earth. And it's a way that you can still use that tool within at least a defined area. If you had all of a sudden to go somewhere else, you'd be out of luck. But they're in a non-internet environment. But it could be that tool's just not the right tool for the job if you're working in a place with prolonged, that you never think that the internet is going to happen there. We have found in terms of the 3D engagement, really very limited opposition to using Google Earth. We basically do exactly what we have here. We bring a projector and a screen or a sheet. We project it very, very large, and we make sure that before we know how to operate Google Earth. We actually use those little Space Command mice, right? They're a little space navigator, I think they're called, that allow you to fly like you're an airplane pilot in Google Earth. And so we get quite adept in flying around, and we work with Google to request imagery updates. So if we're in an area where the imagery is all pixelated, Google usually has processes that they can expedite updating the imagery for the area we're working in. And people have loved it basically, and it's different than having those small scale maps in that you can really zoom in and see the trees and the rocks and lots of details. So in my experience, younger people, older people, they just enjoy it. It's a pleasurable task. Nice way to spend a couple of hours flying around their territories.
Yeah. Something about working with no internet. You can run a Jekyll static site generator locally just on a command line, and also share it on a USB drive. And so you obviously won't necessarily get the granularity of Google Earth, but that's something that in low bandwidth environments has been used for doing visual projects.
Awesome.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
I want to take a minute to thank all of our speakers for today. So if you all would help me give a round of applause to all 4 of our speakers today. It was certainly an engaging day, and I know there's some of you I've seen who've been here all day, so your minds were blown just as much as ours were. We hoped when we put this together that this is how it would come together, and so we're really excited that it did. We have about an hour break right now, so and then we're going to make our way over to the Floyd Center for our roundtable discussion at 4:30 with members from Plateau tribes in the area, and in conversation with our 4 speakers today who've really helped us think about all the different ways that we can reframe landscapes, from thinking of art and thinking of language and politics and policies, and bringing this all together through design choices and digital tools, and that there's not one answer. That was the beauty of today, is that there's all these multiple threads, but that we've seen that these landscapes are animated by people whose relationships are the first and foremost, most important thing. And so if you got anything out of today, I hope it's that place is really about those deep relationships. So thank you again for coming, and I hope all of you can take a little break and meet us over at the Floyd Center at 4:30. Thank you.